Hello and welcome to the 2024 edition of Spooky Shetland from Adventure Shetland. My name is John. I am an archaeologist and a tour guide here in Shetland. I grew up here and I've always been inspired by the landscape and the folklore that has evolved from that here in Shetland. Now, the most numerous creature and stories in that folklore tradition are the Trows. The Trows are our hill people. They're said to be small, kind of grey-coloured, grey clothing. They live underground in caves, mounds, or behind rocks in our remote inland hills and valleys. But they sneak down to the crofts, usually close to the coast, at night time to steal milk from cows or food, or to otherwise look after themselves and their families. Nowadays, the Trows are normally portrayed as mischievous tricksters. They're generally harmless and sometimes even cute. And that's not usually the case in the old stories where the Trows are ugly, scary, fearsome and dangerous. But they were tolerated and respected, even if it was just to ensure your own safety. Now, I don't say that to denigrate modern authors and illustrators of the kids' stories that are being published nowadays. I think anything that introduces our folklore traditions and culture to the bairns is a great thing and should absolutely be supported and encouraged. Today, though, we are going to be looking at the older, scarier stories, because this is Spooky Shetland after all. I've spoken about the Trows for this series before, and I've put links to that in the notes down below. Now, one of the most common types of Trow stories involves the kidnapping of a fiddle player to play at a Trowie wedding or some other foy or celebration. This particular story takes place on the west side of Shetland and tells the tale of Sigurd a Gord. There was once a fiddler named Sigurd, and he lived on the west coast of the Shetland mainland at a place called Gord, near Sannes. Like every other fiddler, he was much in demand at every social gathering. Of course, he didn't get any pay for his music. It was what every fiddler was just expected to do. He and his family lived on a croft and made a frugal living from working the land and a bit of fishing. One afternoon, Sigurd went to fish from the rocks and had considerable success. His basket was so full of fish that he had to rest on the way home, so he took the basket from his back and placed it behind a large rock. While he was sat there resting, he heard music coming from a mound nearby, and when he went closer to listen, the hill opened and it was light inside. The tune being played was new to him, and he was curious to know who the fiddle player was. So when he went in, the opening closed behind him and he couldn't see any way out again. It soon became very clear to Sigurd that this was a place where the Trows lived, and that they were having a serious party. As well as a fiddler playing, dozens of Trows were dancing and drinking and making merry. They seemed to know that Sigurd was a fiddler because he was soon involved in the playing, and at first he really enjoyed himself. Eventually though, he knew that he should go home to his family, and the Trows thanked him for playing, and they opened up the hillside and allowed him to leave. They also said to him that he should keep the fiddle that he'd been playing, and to look on it as a gift from the Trows. It was pitch dark outside, but he knew the area like the back of his hand, and so he was able to get to the big rock and pick up his basket of fish. When he pushed open the door of his home though, he was in for a shock. There was no one there he knew. He was among total strangers. "Who are you? And what are you all doing in my house, and where's my folk?" he demanded. He was in for another shock when he saw his reflection in a mirror. He was a very old man with a white beard. He was dressed in rags, and he was still carrying the fiddle that he got from the Trows. In response to his questions, he was greeted with howls of laughter from the household, especially the younger folk there. The man of the house, the grandfather, was sitting beside the fire smoking his pipe. After some thought, he asked Sigurd who he was. So Sigurd told him and said that he'd been fishing. He'd played a few tunes on the way home, and he implored the grandfather to tell him what was going on. "There was a man with your name that lived here, but that was 100 years ago. He went fishing one night and never came back, so they thought he'd fallen into the sea and been washed away." "Well, where's my folk then?" asked Sigurd. "Your folk are all dead and we are no relation to them. We came here when this croft became empty and we've been the tenants ever since." "Well, if my folk are all dead, the best thing I can do is go and join them. So saying that, Sigurd turned on his heel and went back outside. One young man in the house had never laughed at Sigurd. He felt sorry for this old, confused man. And beside, he was also a fiddler, and was interested in the fiddle that Sigurd carried. He followed Sigurd outside and watched them walk up through the yard at the back of the house to the boundary wall where there was a well. He stopped, put the fiddle under his chin, played a tune that the boy had never heard before. That done, Sigurd collapsed, and the young man found the remains of a man that was no more than dust and the fiddle beside him. The young man had a great ear for music, and he was able to remember the tune that Sigurd played, and fiddlers still know this tune today. Now, it wasn't just musicians who were in high demand among the Trows. Indeed, midwives also seem to have been required by the hill folk, as several stories attest. This is one of those stories. In any community, the Howdy Wife was a most important person. In a large community, there might have been several Howdy women working together or individually. Someone describing the duties of a Howdy once said, "They're there when someone comes into the world, and there when someone leaves the world." So essentially, they are midwives, but they also prepared dead folk for burial too. Some of them had a kind of a mystic air about them, and occasionally the hint of witchcraft, causing some folk to look on them in awe. When called to assist a birth, a Howdy Wife would never tolerate the presence of men in the house. They were told, in no uncertain terms, to go and not return until after the birth. Some Howdy women were more highly regarded than others, and therefore they were more in demand. One such woman was at home, looking after her house, when a knock came to the door. This was pretty unusual. In those days no one locked their door and anyone visiting just walked in. It was dark outside, but she could see a very small man who stood outside her door, and she just instinctively knew that he was a Trow. She invited him in, and he said that he needed her help. He explained that his wife was in labour, and had been for some time, and that she needed expert help to give birth. The Howdy Wife put on her outdoor clothes, and they set off to where the Trows lived. Now, this woman knew about Trows, everyone did, but she didn't know where they lived or how they lived. Outside they walked through the village, and as her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, she was aware of passing familiar landmarks. After a time, she was seeing a landscape that she didn't know. They were in a place totally strange to her, and she began to feel a bit uneasy. However, the Trow reassured her that no harm would come to her, and she could trust him to take her back. At last, the Trow led her into a house, and into a bedroom where the Trow's wife was lying on the bed in a state of great distress. The Howdy Wife took off her coat and examined the woman, and she could see why the birth was so difficult. Using all her skill and experience, she managed to bring the child into the world, and the father was incredibly grateful. He gave the wife a small bag filled with gold coins and offered to escort her back to her home. By this time the daylight was coming in, and the Howdy Wife could see her surroundings more clearly. There was no doubt she was in a place she'd never seen before. After what seemed like a long walk, she began to see once more things that she did recognise. The Trow halted and asked if she knew where she was. She nodded. He asked if she was sure that she could find her way back to her own home again, and she nodded. Without another word, he took from his pocket a small jar. He removed the top, dipped it in his finger, and smeared a small amount of ointment on both her eyes. When she blinked to clear her vision, the Trow had disappeared, and when she looked back, there was nothing but the village and the places that she'd known all her life. Rather bemused, she made her way back to where she lived, but the experience of being in the place of the Trows was a memory that was almost foremost in her thoughts. Many a time she retraced her steps and walked in the same direction as the Trow took her, but no matter how far she walked, she never saw any trace of the place where she'd been able to deliver the Trow baby. In time, she got on with her life as it had been before she had her encounter with the Trows. The long winter passed, and with it, the long dark nights. Summer was a busy time for everyone, with fishing, agriculture, and a host of other things to do as well. One summer task that involved everyone in the community was the day that all the sheep were rounded up to be shorn. Shetland sheep have very soft wool, and they sometimes shed it naturally. It can also be pulled off the sheep by hand, and clippers aren't always necessary. And this job is often done by men, women and children, and as well as being a job, it was also something of a social event because everyone was there. The sheep were all crowded into a large pen and taken out one by one to get the wool taken off them, or rude as we would say here. The Howdy Wife was there too, and when she looked into the pen she was astonished to see a Trow in among the sheep. He was not that much taller than the sheep were, but there was no doubt at all that he was the very same Trow that had asked her for her help. He was wearing a tunic with a tight belt around his waist, and a bag was hanging from that belt, and the Trow was stealing wool. Every sheep he went past, he would take a handful of the wool and shove it into this bag tied to his waist. She didn't mention this to anyone else because it was clear that no one had seen him, and if she raised a hue and cry, the folk would think she'd gone mad. So she watched and waited, and when the Trow had the bag full of wool, he left the pen. She made her way around behind the pen, behind all the people, until she got close to him, and then she spoke. "How's your wife and child, the one I delivered?" she asked. "They're doing well," he answered. "But how did you know that I was here?" "Oh, I can see you," she said. "Can you see me with both eyes?" was the next question. The Howdy Wife experimented by closing first one eye and then the other. "I can see you with my left, but not the right eye," she told him. The Trow stood up right on his tiptoes and grabbed hold of her shawl and pulled her down until their faces were close together. He then blew into her left eye, which caused her to blink. When she opened it again, she found that she could no longer see anything from her left eye. She couldn't see the Trow or anything else. She was totally blind in that eye for the rest of her life. There we have the story of a Trow taking retribution for a human act. In this next one though, a story from Yell, it's the Trows who make the first move. Especially in the autumn and the early winter, men often went fishing from the rocks, which was called going to the craigs. They fished for young coalfish known as silks, and bigger ones, which we'd call pilticks. This was done partly because it's good food, and partly as recreation. After a hard day's work, it was therapeutic to sit at the shore and catch plentiful fish. The best time of day for this was when the light was beginning to fade, and a keen fisherman would stay until it was almost dark and the fish stopped taking the lures. In the hamlet of Gloop, in North Yell, there was a man called Monsey Spence. He was on his way home with a basket well filled with silks and pilticks. He lived a fair piece from the shore, and he sat down for a short rest. The place he chose for this was a large stone, perhaps 12 feet long, 4 feet wide and 2 feet thick. It was known as a place where the Trows lived. There are many stories of men hearing music on their way home from the craigs. Trows are very fond of fiddle music, and many Shetland tunes are said to have come from them. Monsey didn't hear any music, but what he was acutely aware of was a sharp pain in his ankle. He got up and he limped home. Pain eased to an ache, but his ankle was still really uncomfortable that he couldn't ignore it, couldn't let it go. He knew for sure that it was a Trow who had struck him, and he knew why they'd done it and what they wanted. So he limped home and set about gutting and washing the fish ready to cook for the supper. The fish was boiled in a big kettle, and Monsey told his wife to keep the brew, the water that the fish had been boiled in. Monsey and his family enjoyed a delicious meal of boiled pilticks and silks and new tatties, potatoes, with the melted fish livers poured over the top. After he'd finished eating, Monsey poured the brew that was left over in the kettle into a big can, and he set off back to the big stone where he had rested on his way home. His ankle was still sore, but it wasn't so bad that he couldn't walk. And so when he reached the stone, he started to circle around it, pouring out a little bit of the fish brew as he went, and as he did so, the pain in his ankle lessened, and by the time that he shoot the last drops out of the can, completing a circle of the stone, the pain was gone entirely. Monsey smiled to himself, because he'd been right. The Trows had been craving for silk brew, and now that they'd got some, they released Monsey from his pain, and he strode home fully restored, no doubt with a bit of a spring in his step. It might surprise you to learn that Trows absolutely despise untidiness and disorder around the house, and folk would go to quite significant lengths to make sure everything was spick and span before bedtime, just in case any visitors came along during the night. Pails of water would be carried in from the well, the fire would be cleaned and kind of built up with fresh peats for the night, pots and pans were scrubbed and set away so the Trows would see clearly this was a well-doing family, and when they departed they would leave a blessing on the house. On the other hand, if the house was found in a dirty condition with the pots and pans unwashed, the hearth in a state of untidiness, the Trows would realise that this was a thriftless family, and the house would be witched for a year and a day. One night, a Trow mother came in from the cold, carrying her baby intending to bath it beside the fire. To her disgust, she found the water pails empty, and it seemed that she would be unable to wash her child. She went over to the milk churn, filled a plate with bland, and proceeded to wash her baby in it. When she had finished, she poured the bland back into the churn, saying, "Tak ye dat, you should have had water in." It's a well-known fact that when the Trows took a liking to the water of a certain well, they would use the contents of the milk churn if the water pails were empty, rather than seeking water in another house whose water came from a different well. I think we'll finish up on a slightly lighter note with a couple of more positive encounters people have had with the Trows. This first one is from the island of Fetler, and it explains the origin of one of Shetland's favourite Trowy tunes, Debs. On the east side of Fetler there was a water mill called Farva. Grinding grain was always done in the winter, because in Shetland there aren't any rivers and not a lot of plentiful water to drive a mill. However, with the winter rain, some of the streams are powerful enough to do the job effectively. Mills were often owned by communities, so when the conditions were right there would be numerous families all needing the mill at the same time. This meant that often the mill was used at night as well as during the day. There was a small building beside Farva that was used for storing straw, and it would be a place for a miller to rest while the mill was grinding. The miller might even sleep among the straw, as after filling the hopper with grain and setting the mill going, there was nothing more to do really. Miller always knew if the hopper was empty because it made a different noise when it had to be refilled. Not everyone fancied the idea of being at that mill alone though, because there had always been reports of Trows visiting it. One man who had no fear of the Trows went there boldly. It was nighttime and dark with just a measure of moonlight. He was a big powerful man and he carried several bags of grain there on his back. There was no wind, the mill was silent, and the only sound was the waves lapping gently on the nearby shore. After the mill was in motion, and he was satisfied that everything was working as it should, he went into the building next door and bedded himself down, snuggling among the straw to enjoy the rest and a pinch or two of snuff forby. After a time he dozed off, but became wide awake when he heard a familiar sound coming from the shore. It was the sound of a boat's keel striking the shingle beach as it landed. He got up and looked out of the door. The moon was a bit brighter now and he could see quite clearly a number of Trows stepping ashore from the boat. It was not uncommon for the Trows to steal boats, although they usually brought them back again once they were finished. The Trows trooped up the shore and they were heading straight for the mill. The man wasn't quite as brave now, so he went back into the building and retreated into the furthest corner and covered himself with as much straw as he could. He hoped that if he made no noise, they would never know that he was there, but as soon as they came into the building, one of them said, "Well, we'll not trouble the sleeper. He's not a bad man, and we can play him a tune." One of them had a fiddle, and they played the same tune over and over and over again while the rest danced. This went on for a very long time, and the miller had heard the tune so often that it was firmly planted in his brain. When the Trows became aware of the first signs of dawn, they left, but the miller stayed there until he heard the keel of the boat scraping once more on the shingle. When he looked out, he could see the boat leaving the shore again. By this time, the mill was long finished grinding, so he stopped it, bagged up his meal and headed for home. The family thought that he'd been away far too long, and so they were slightly worried about him. He assured them though that all was fine, and he told them of his encounter with the Trows. First, they laughed at him, but he said that he could prove it. His son was a fiddler, and so he told the boy to go and fetch the fiddle. "You know that I have never composed a tune in my life, but I have a tune that the Trows have given me. I know it's a tune you've never heard before." He hummed the tune over a few times. It's a rather simple melody, and the boy soon picked it up, and before long he was playing it freely. It became a popular tune in Fetler, and fiddlers all over Shetland learned it. At first, it was known as Old Gibby's tune, Gibby being the name of the miller. The tune is still popular now, but it is called Debs. It's a far bonier name, I have to say, and that's the name of the loch that supplied the Farva with water. And our final story today is one of the more well-known Trowy tales, I would suspect. Farker's Pig. It was close to Christmas, but in the Farker household the conversation was more about Trows than the festive season. For some reason, the Trows seemed to be more active at Yule time. Perhaps it's because of the winter solstice, or perhaps it was that they sought the warmth of people's homes. Most Shetland houses in the old days consisted of just 2 rooms. In the kitchen there was always a box bed. It looked more like a cupboard with sliding doors. The box bed in the kitchen was where young Henry Farker slept, and his mother asked him if he was frightened of the Trows. "No, I'm no," said Henry. "You've told me time and again what to say if the Trows bother me." Henry sounded very confident, but he was a bit worried and he couldn't get to sleep. After lying awake for more than an hour, he heard somebody opening the door of the house. No one ever locked a house door, so it was easy to get in. Henry was up on his knees and there was an open seam between the boards of the sliding door. There was very little light, but he could see two shapes, Trows, and they were carrying bundles. It was a man and a woman. The man went to the fire and took away the big wet pates that were there to ensure that the fire lay in for the whole night. He stirred the embers and put on some small dry pates from the basket beside the fire. When the fire was revived, it filled the room with light, and Henry could see that the woman was carrying a baby in her arms. He could also see that the baby had sore eyes, as the eyelids were red and swollen. The man had a pig, which was an earthenware jug with a tight cork and a handle on the side for carrying. The woman spoke. "Put it beside the fire so the oil warms. It'll no work if it's too cold." The man put the pig close to the fire and they waited. The woman spoke again. "The Piri Ulet in the bed will never know that we're here." Piri Ulet means like a little rascal. It came as a shock to Henry that the Trows were aware of his presence, but he kept very still and as quiet as he could. The woman took from a pocket a small bottle and filled it with oil from the pig. She then very gently rubbed a small amount of the oil onto the sore eyes of the baby, and immediately the eyes were cured, all the redness gone, and the child was comfortable again. Henry saw the man approaching the bed, and for the first time he was really frightened, and remembered what his mother had taught him. "God be aboot me and the pig," he shouted. Immediately there was a small flash of light and an explosion, or crack. When Henry looked out again, the Trows had disappeared. There was no one in the kitchen but himself, but the pig still stood by the fire. His parents heard his shout, and so they got up and came through. Henry told them what had taken place, and although he was only 9 years old, he claimed the pig for his own. The contents of it proved to be truly remarkable. It was an oil of a sort, but it could cure all ills. If anyone had any problems of the skin, a tiny amount rubbed onto the sore place was all that was needed, and any other health problems, a small spoonful worked wonders. News of this magic medicine spread, and folk came from near and far to take enough to cure their illnesses. Henry never turned anyone away, and he gave a small quantity to all who asked. In time, Henry's parents both died of old age. Henry was married and he had 3 daughters. Henry's wife was as kindly as he was, and she gave oil from the pig to all that needed it. By this time, Henry had the pig for 20 years and it was still full. It was truly magic, and Henry instinctively knew that it would always replenish itself so long as it was never emptied, so he was always careful not to take too much at any one time. Henry's 3 daughters all grew up, got married and left home, and Henry himself was getting on in years when his wife died. He was by himself for a time, but eventually he got married again. Sadly, his second wife was not as kind as the first though. She had a hard and mercenary streak, and she was adamant that Henry should sell the oil rather than give it away. "No, no," he says, "I got the pig with the oil for nothing, and it'd be wrong to try and make a profit from it." His wife wasn't convinced. She complained that so many folk came to the house that she couldn't get on with the work that she needed to do. So one day when Henry was away, she charged 2 women a sum of money for the oil that they got. They were willing enough to pay, as the benefits from the oil were so great that it was well worth the money. The following day, another 8 folk came for oil, and they were also willing to pay. However, when Henry picked up the pig, he knew immediately that something was very wrong. The pig was as light as a feather, and it was empty. It never gave another drop of oil after that, and the spell had been broken by his wife's greed. So there we go. That's a few Trowy stories for the Spooky Shetland 2024 special. Thank you so much for listening, and also thank you to Rory Goodlad, Mayo, Scott Goudie, James Gordon and Debs, Skelton. They are all backers on Patreon, and if you would also like to have your name in the credits of these episodes, then head to the link in the show notes below and sign up as a backer. There is also a Spooky Shetland special on there just for patrons, explaining the origins of the Trows and where they might have come from. So if that's of interest to you, you'll be able to get it there too. There is also more Spooky Shetland content on YouTube. There is a playlist of all of the previous Spooky Shetland content that I've made linked in the notes, as well as are links to our social media pages if you want to keep up to date with all things Adventure Shetland. Now, if you fancy hearing more folk tales and history while exploring the landscapes that both inspire and play host to these stories, why not book a guided tour with me in Shetland? The website for all the details is linked down below. It's adventureshetland.com. But thank you again for listening, and I hope you have a spooky and safe Halloween, and watch out for the Trows.